When I first got the job at VSRP, the local midnight radio station, I thought I had hit the jackpot of easy living. Sit in a creaky chair, play some records for a few night owls and insomniacs, maybe humor a couple of bored callers if I was in the mood. The pay? Not exactly dream-worthy, but enough to scrape by. Rent, groceries, and the occasional beer were all I needed. It was the kind of gig where you showed up half asleep and left half conscious, and I was fine with that. The station itself was nothing to write home about. An old, peeling building squatted by a lonely rural highway, its silhouette swallowed by a thick canopy of looming trees. It carried a certain outdated charm, or maybe just the weight of abandonment. The walls inside were lined with wood paneling that had warped over the years, as if they were slowly sagging into a permanent shrug. The break room smelled faintly of mildew and cheap instant coffee, and the sagging couch there looked like it had been rescued from a junkyard decades ago. A flickering neon sign buzzed feebly above the front door, casting sickly pink light on the gravel lot. The equipment, a mismatched collection of knobs, dials, and cassette decks, was older than me, ancient in tech years, but it worked, albeit with the same reluctance as an aging horse forced to trot. The man who hired me, Carl, had a wiry build and an unsettling, nervous energy. His fingers twitched when he handed me the keys, and his eyes darted around the room like he was expecting something, or someone, to leap out of the shadows. "Here's the rundown," he muttered, barely meeting my gaze. His voice was as thin as his frame, trembling slightly. He gestured vaguely at the equipment, gave me a rushed tutorial on how to operate the aging machines, and then handed me a single piece of paper. It was a list. "Follow these exactly," he said, his tone dropping an octave. "No exceptions." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me, leaning into the whole eerie late-night DJ vibe. But Carl didn't laugh back. His expression hardened, his lips tightening as if my chuckle had offended him. He shoved the paper into my hand, his fingers gripping mine just a second too long. "I'm serious," he hissed, his eyes boring into mine. "You mess this up, you're not gonna like what happens." I unfolded the list, still half expecting it to be a prank. But as I read the rules, an uneasy weight settled in my chest. The rules were bizarre, borderline absurd. Play a jazz record at exactly 3:06 a.m. It must be jazz. No exceptions. Never answer calls from line 7. If it rings, let it ring. If you hear knocking on the studio door, check the security camera before opening it. If no one's there, don't open it. Do not play the same song twice in one night. If you hear static coming from the microphone when it's off, turn off all the lights and sit quietly until it stops. I wanted to roll my eyes and ask Carl if this was some kind of hazing ritual for new hires, but when I looked up, his face stopped me cold. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and a fine sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He looked scared. Not nervous, not joking, scared. That first night, I didn't take any chances. I followed the rules, partly out of respect for the job, but mostly because Carl's reaction had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. The shift passed uneventfully. Line 7 stayed silent, the door stayed still, and the microphone didn't so much as crackle. For a moment, I thought Carl had just been overly paranoid. But then came the second night, and that's when I got careless. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I spun some classic rock, familiar tunes that made the graveyard hours feel less lonely. A couple of bored night owls called in to chat, their voices crackling with the kind of late-night aimlessness that only comes with insomnia. I read a few ad scripts, stumbling slightly over one for a discount furniture store, and chuckled to myself as I imagined who could possibly be listening at this hour. It was all routine, quiet, mundane. Then, as the clock inched closer to 3 a.m., I remembered Carl's jazz rule. My stomach did a little flip, a combination of annoyance and unease. I'd almost forgotten. Grumbling under my breath, I began rifling through the station's dusty stacks of vinyl, my fingers brushing against worn, paper-thin sleeves. Most of the records were decades old, their covers faded and stained, smelling faintly of mildew and neglect. Finally, I found an old Siles Davis album. The sleeve was tattered, the vinyl scratched, but it would do. I slid it onto the turntable and set it up, waiting for the clock to tick to 3:06. When the second hand struck the mark, I dropped the needle onto the record. The warm, honeyed sound of the trumpet poured out of the speakers, filling the studio with smooth, soulful energy. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a satisfied breath. Good job, I thought. I'd remembered. No mistakes tonight. But as the music played, something started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, just a faint noise, barely noticeable beneath the melody. I dismissed it as static, or the wear of the old vinyl. But the longer I listened, the more it seemed like something else, like a whisper. I leaned forward, my ear closer to the monitor, trying to make out the sound. My skin prickled. The whisper wasn't random. It had rhythm, a cadence, like someone muttering just below the surface of the music. My pulse quickened, and I turned up the volume slightly, straining to catch it. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice, low, raspy, and wrong. "Don't stop," it said. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My eyes flicked to the microphone. The red light was off. It wasn't live. The voice wasn't coming from me. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared at the speakers, hoping, praying, that I was imagining things. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Don't stop the music." I shot out of my chair, panic surging through me. My hands trembled as I stopped the record, the needle screeching as it lifted from the vinyl. The voice cut off instantly. The studio was silent, so silent that the hum of the old fluorescent light above me sounded deafening. I stood there, frozen, trying to catch my breath. I glanced at the clock. My stomach dropped. 3:10 a.m., 4 minutes late. A wave of dread washed over me. My fingers gripped the edge of the console as Carl's warning echoed in my mind. "You're not gonna like what happens." And then the phone rang. Not just any phone, line 7. The shrill, electronic cry cut through the suffocating silence, sharp and jarring. I flinched, my heart slamming against my ribs. My eyes locked on the blinking red light of the forbidden line, and my stomach churned. Carl's words pounded in my head. "Never answer calls from line 7. It rang again, and again. Each ring seemed to grow louder, more piercing, like the sound itself was burrowing into my skull. My hands trembled as I took an instinctive step back from the desk, bumping into the chair behind me. The room felt colder, darker. The air was thick, heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. The ringing didn't stop. It kept going, louder and louder, more shrill with every chime, until it felt like the entire building was vibrating with it. I clapped my hands over my ears, desperate to block out the sound, and squeezed my eyes shut, my breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I opened my eyes and froze. The studio was pitch black. Every light, the overhead fluorescence, the control panel, even the flickering neon sign outside was out. The soft hum of electricity that I hadn't even realized I'd been hearing was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. The world outside the windows was nothing but an impenetrable void. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I heard it, the knocking. At first it was barely there, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the studio door, so faint I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. Check the security camera before opening it. Carl's rule came rushing back to me. My fingers fumbled across the desk, searching blindly in the darkness for the monitor switch. I found it and flipped it on with trembling hands. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the room. The hallway outside the studio came into view. The grainy black and white feed showed nothing but the empty corridor stretching out into the shadows. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice thin and cracking with fear. No answer. The camera feed remained empty. The hallway was still and lifeless, but the sound of knocking persisted. It grew sharper, more urgent, each blow reverberating through the studio walls. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't a polite knock anymore. It was angry, violent, as if someone or something was trying to force its way inside. My legs buckled, and I stumbled back, clutching the crumpled list of rules in my hand like it was a lifeline, as though it might somehow shield me from whatever was out there. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the banging stopped. Silence fell over the studio once more. But it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was oppressive, unnatural, a void that pressed against my ears and made my chest feel tight. The absence of noise was worse than the sound itself. I stood frozen, every muscle locked, my ears straining against the suffocating quiet, waiting for what would come next. I sat there, folded into myself, knees pressed tightly to my chest like they were the only thing holding me together. The studio felt like a tomb, and I was its reluctant occupant. Every sound, the groaning of the building settling, the faint whispers of the wind through the trees, felt magnified, sinister. My eyes darted around the blackened room, searching for threats I couldn't see. And then it came, the static. It started softly, around 4 a.m., a faint crackle that barely broke the suffocating silence. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was coming from the microphone. The one I knew for a fact was off. I'd switched it off hours ago. But there it was, alive with that eerie, unnatural hiss. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a malfunction, maybe interference from the storm clouds gathering outside. But deep down, I knew better. The static grew louder, its pitch shifting in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I stared at the mic, its lifeless red light mocking me. My breath quickened. Then the voice came. "Why didn't you follow the rules?" It was the same voice I'd heard earlier, low and grating, but now there was venom in it, an unfiltered fury that made my stomach churn. I scrambled to the control panel, my hands shaking as I tried to shut it down. I jabbed at the buttons, twisted the knobs, yanked at wires. Nothing worked. The microphone seemed alive, immune to my desperation. The voice came again, louder this time. "Why didn't you follow the rules?" Each word seemed to stab into my mind, echoing and expanding until it was all I could hear. The static swelled, its relentless buzz filling the room like a flood, drowning out my thoughts, my heartbeat, everything. Why didn't you follow the rules? It wasn't just coming from the speakers anymore. It was everywhere, the walls, the floor, the air itself. It burrowed into my head, reverberating like a thunderclap inside my skull. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was already in me. I screamed, the raw sound ripping from my throat, but it was swallowed up by the cacophony. The static surged, a deafening roar that left no room for anything else. And then, silence. It stopped. The sudden quiet was like a slap, almost more jarring than the noise had been. My ears rang, my body trembling as I stared at the microphone now dormant, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had changed. Something was watching, waiting. The lights flickered back on, weak and hesitant at first, before fully flooding the studio with their dull, buzzing glow. It felt unnatural, like the building itself had been holding its breath and now, reluctantly, was letting it out. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my vision adjusting, and for a moment, it was like waking up from a nightmare I wasn't entirely sure was over. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands resting on 6 a.m. My shift was over. The night that had stretched on for what felt like an eternity had finally given way to morning. But the usual relief, the kind that comes with punching out and heading home, was nowhere to be found. All I felt was exhaustion, fear, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. My legs wobbled as I stood, the journey from the studio to the parking lot feeling longer than it ever should. The crisp morning air hit me like a shock, but it wasn't refreshing. It was cold and indifferent, a harsh reminder that the world outside had gone on, oblivious to whatever horror lurked within that studio. Carl was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his battered old sedan. His face was pale, drawn tight with a weariness that looked permanent, like someone who had seen too much and didn't bother trying to forget anymore. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew he didn't need to ask. He could see it written all over me. "You broke the rules, didn't you?" His voice was soft, but there was no sympathy in it, just resignation. I nodded, my throat too dry to form words. Carl sighed heavily, like a man carrying a burden that was never truly his, but one he had resigned himself to bear. From his pocket, he pulled out a folded sheet of paper, edges worn and smudged with fingerprints. He handed it to me without a word. I unfolded it with trembling hands. A new list, different rules, stricter, stranger. "Next time," Carl said, his tone as serious as a funeral, "do exactly what it says, or you won't make it to the morning." His words hung in the air, chilling and absolute. I wanted to ask him what it was, what exactly haunted the studio during those suffocating midnight hours. But the look in his eyes silenced me. I didn't want to know. Not really. Carl climbed into his car and drove off, leaving me alone in the parking lot. The paper in my hand felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of some dark truth I was now bound to. I still don't know what's out there, what claws at the edges of the station during those cursed hours. But I've learned one thing, burned into my mind like a brand. The rules aren't suggestions. They're not some quirky manual written by a paranoid ex-employee. They're a lifeline, the only thing standing between me and whatever waits in the shadows. Every time I clock an hour, I read the list, over and over. I memorize every line, every rule, as if my life depends on it. Because it does. I don't question them. I don't get curious. Curiosity is what killed the last guy. I never met him, but I see the name scratched into the desk, carved by a trembling hand. Because the moment you stop following the rules, the station makes its own.